there are universities that teach courses in marine science, and they have courses where they talk about phosphorus for a whole semester. That's 16 weeks. They generally lecture for about 3 hours a week, and I'm going to try to walk you through all of this in the next 20 minutes. So, in a sense, maybe you should be grateful, because this is a quick course in phosphorus. While you're looking at this slide, let me tell you what I'm going to try to cover today. First, I'm going to show you some simple models of how phosphorus affects water quality in estuaries like Chesapeake Bay, but not just Chesapeake Bay, estuaries around the world. And then I'm going to show you some more realistic ways that phosphorus actually works. The world is complicated, and I think we all need to recognize that. I'm going to show you some of that complexity. The second thing I'm going to show you is also a little bit complicated, and that is what are the dominant controls on phosphorus in these estuarine systems? What makes it active? What makes it inactive? Where does it eventually go? So dominant controls. And I'm going to end with an example of restoration, and that is an example of where phosphorus and nitrogen were significantly, meaning cut in half, to a piece of Chesapeake Bay, and we were able to watch the response of that ecosystem. In other words, a restoration example. The only comment I'll make on this slide, other than to say it is a big and complicated system where the land and the water are intimately connected. It reminds me of looking at the capillaries in a lung. Nobody who lives in this Chesapeake Basin actually lives very far from tidal water, because we are all connected by streams, creeks, and rivers, and they move material from the land to the estuary, oftentimes with amazing speed. Secondly, it says up there, estuary flushes slowly. Chesapeake Bay has this characteristic. The water hangs around. We do not have huge tides. Many parts of the Chesapeake Bay are 100 miles or more from the quote-unquote clean and salty waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. So what we put in the bay tends to hang around in the bay. So this is a double-edged sword. One of the reasons that the Chesapeake Bay is so productive is that when we put things like nitrogen and phosphorus in it, it is used, it is reused, and it is reused again. Some estimates indicate that a molecule of nitrogen that enters the bay in the spring is used 7 or 8 times that year before it finally deposits in the sediment, goes back to the atmosphere, or makes it to the Atlantic Ocean. So we have an estuary that has extraordinary productive potential. There was a writer, a newspaper writer from Baltimore named H.L. Mencken, and one of his best lines ever, I think, was that the Chesapeake Bay is a huge protein factory from which we eat divinely. I thought that was a pretty cool thing. And it is a protein factory. The other side of that sword is that what we put in stays here. So it is prone to over-enrichment. Part of me is an engineer, and engineers like rules of thumb, and one of their rules of thumb is that in some circumstances, dilution can be the solution to pollution. And that is not a good solution for the Chesapeake Bay, because the water hangs around for a long time. So, how do I click this thing forward? Thank you. All right, so let me get going here. This is a simple diagram of an ecosystem, an estuarine ecosystem, that does not have a nutrient enrichment problem. And what we see in the circle is a modest assemblage of algae in the water column. And most importantly, we see, and this is particularly important for shallow estuaries like Chesapeake Bay, we see a well-developed bottom community that includes both plants and animals. There's a whole trophic structure that runs off of this bottom of the estuary. That's an estuary that has modest inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus. This is what we see in lots of Chesapeake Bay right now. We have a huge algal assemblage. We have a lot of those algae dying, sinking to deep water, being decomposed by bacteria primarily, and that leads to a lack of oxygen in the well-known dead zones. So we lose habitat space, and that's bad. We've recently learned that oxygen problems can also occur in waters that are only a meter or two deep. And those oxygen problems do not occur on a seasonal basis like they do in the deep water, but rather on a daily basis. And that is, oxygen is very, very low at times before the sun comes up, stays low till around 8 or 9 in the morning, and then can soar to extraordinary high levels during the day. So that is another scale of dead zone that occurs repeatedly day after day in some of these nutrient-enriched shallow waters. So this is a diagram that I don't need to explain to this audience. What it says is that with fertilization, production goes up. You guys know that better than I do in terms of agricultural fields. It is also apparently true in estuaries. That is, the production of foodstuff increases as we increase fertilization to a certain point. As an aside, I might say that many audiences I talk to think about nitrogen and phosphorus as a pollutant, when in fact nitrogen and phosphorus are the stuff of life. If we didn't have it, we'd be toast. Well, actually, we wouldn't even be toast, because toast has some nitrogen and phosphorus in it. So what we're talking about here, the problem we're having in these estuarine waters, creeks, streams, rivers, whatever, lakes, is a problem of too much of a good thing. And frankly, I would much rather face that problem than having the Chesapeake Bay that was filled with mercury, or filled with PCBs, or filled with other kinds of heavy metals which are truly toxic. So we are dealing with the problem of trying to reduce too much of a good thing. I tell some audiences that there's an analogy here with food. We all have to eat, okay? If we don't eat, we die. If we eat too much, we get too big. We have an obesity problem, and things start to fall apart. There's a strong analogy to the way estuaries work with regards to nitrogen and phosphorus. It is essential. Too much is bad. So when we get too much, we call it eutrophic. Some people are calling it nutrient obesity. Some people say we need to put the bay on a nutrient diet. I agree with all of that. And here are some of the things on the bottom of that slide that result when we over-enrich these coastal systems. Blooms and odors. Some of these blooms are toxic. We call them harmful algal blooms, HABs. We have loss of oxygen in lots of habitats. Water clarity goes down. We lose the seagrasses. Benthic production goes down. And there's disruption in the trophic system that produces the seafoods that we all enjoy. So we have this spectrum of effects. So that's the simple story. That's the kind of story I tell most audiences. But this is the real story. These systems, just like your agricultural systems, are loaded up with feedbacks of various sorts. And these feedbacks change the behavior of the system. So in the simple case, what I would say is that there are times when you can put N and P in an estuary, more and more and more, and it seems to be doing just fine, and you add a little bit more and it falls off a cliff. Okay? That's called what we call a threshold. So what I'm going to show you here in the next few slides is this whole idea of the feedbacks in these systems, which are really important. So here's the story. This is called the degradation story. The restoration story is very, very similar. So this story starts with more nitrogen and phosphorus getting into the system, which grows more algae, increases the turbidity of the water. That leads, as these plants decompose, we lose oxygen in the deep water, and when that happens, the sediments change their nature. They go from being oxidizing, that's brown mud, to reducing, that's black mud. A process called denitrification, which many of you know about, also stops because there's no supply of nitrate in these reducing environments. That leads to more recycling of nitrogen and phosphorus. Phosphorus that would have been sequestered in the sediments is now on the loose. Nitrogen that would have gone back to the atmosphere is now ammonium, and it's on the loose and produces a nutrient feedback which starts to grow more algae, which has the tendency to make this all worse. So that's the basic concept, and it gets more interesting. With less light, there's less benthic production, meaning the seagrasses and these small algae that grow on the bottom sediments, incredibly important food source, they start to go away. Because they've gone away, they take up less nitrogen and phosphorus. And these little algae that grow on the sediment surface basically act like flypaper on the sediment. They suppress resuspension. So we get more resuspension and more recycling, and water quality, water clarity starts to decrease. The story doesn't finish there. We have disease and overharvest issues in many estuaries, including the bay. We have a degraded oyster system. In fact, we have a degraded benthic system. There are many other creatures that do the same thing that oysters do that are also suffering at present. And because of that, they are not removing nitrogen and phosphorus from the water, and they are not stabilizing the sediments, so we wind up with more algae and more turbidity. We also have sea level rise, which can erode marshlands as well as others. These marshes, of course, made of sediments, and they store lots of N and P, and so we start to get less uptake because the marshes are eroded, and those erosion materials go out into the bay and form another feedback, which induces more algae and more turbidity. So this is the way we really think it works, and this is the kind of thinking that's being incorporated into water quality models in the modern world. I'm showing you this slide here to give you the idea that estuaries and coastal systems are complicated. They're different. So this is a plot of the phosphorus load on the horizontal axis coupled with the nitrogen load on the vertical axis for about 40 different estuaries from around the world. So this is the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, that's what each dot represents, that gets into these different coastal ecosystems each year. The brown bar indicates the nitrogen dosage to many landscapes, many temperate landscapes. And what we see here is that lots of these estuaries are quote-unquote dosed with NNP at levels that exceed what we normally dose the land at. So that's point one. Point two is that the phosphorus loads to these estuaries vary by 3 orders of magnitude. Not 30 or 40%, 3 orders of magnitude, and the nitrogen loads by about 2 orders of magnitude. In general, what we need to do with the Chesapeake systems is walk them back down that line from high to lower. That's the goal of the Bay program, or one of the many goals. So that's the second point. The third point is that those little red boxes are from the Patuxent River estuary over on the western shore. And you can see that's for a 13-year time series. And the loads going into that estuary are not the same year after year. They vary. And that's caused largely by local annual weather conditions. In wet years, the loads are higher than they are in dry years. So what we need to keep in mind is we're not looking at something that's static, but rather something that's relatively dynamic. Many of the systems of the Chesapeake have nutrient load variations between drought and flood years by about a factor of 2. And the last thing is that little green box. That's the Back River estuary. It's just north of Baltimore. It receives a lot of drainage from a landscape that's 40% impervious, and it receives a great deal of the sewage from the city of Baltimore. The nutrient loading rate to that, in my world, makes no sense to you, so I converted the numbers to numbers that you might relate to. And so the nitrogen loading rate to the system is about 900 pounds per acre per year. And if my agricultural friends are not telling me stories, that is considerably higher than corn fertilization rates by a healthy margin. The phosphorus loading rates, however, I'm told, are not as outrageous. And one of the reasons is that this sewage treatment plant, when these data were collected, was doing an excellent job of reducing the amount of phosphorus getting into the system. So one of the take-home messages here are variability. The fact that most of the Chesapeake systems sit above that gray line, we need to move them back down that line. When we do, as I'll show you later, I think we'll get the results that we like. So one thing we're collectively sure of in the marine science community is that there's plenty of room for additional degradation. We have not hit bottom here. This is a photo from the Potomac River during a microcystis bloom. Those blooms, fortunately, do not occur everywhere and all the time, but we could if we increase loads, encourage that kind of behavior. We've learned things from our Chinese friends, where nutrient loading to some of their coastal systems are truly rampant. These are people trying to enjoy a day at the beach. And that green stuff is a result of excessive amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus getting into the system. All right, so now let's start talking more specifically about phosphorus. This is a wonderful piece of work that a fellow named Tom Fisher did. It took him years to do the work. And what this diagram is trying to show us is when is nitrogen and when is phosphorus the prime controlling nutrient regulating algal growth in Chesapeake Bay. It's called a time-space diagram. So on the vertical, we see the seasons of the year, and on the horizontal, distance from the ocean. So if we were to walk up that 150 line and go over to the spring, we would see that phosphorus is the controlling nutrient. That would be somewhere near just above Annapolis, Maryland, in the winter. Winter, spring. So what this diagram is telling us, and what these data, as well as work done with various other kinds of manipulations, is that nitrogen and phosphorus are important in Chesapeake Bay. They're both important. They're important in different places and at different times. So the Bay program has developed what's called a dual nutrient strategy, and that's a good thing. It seems to me like it's an essential thing. I think it's particularly important in the springtime, late winter and spring, because that's the time the big diatom blooms develop in the bay. And they seem to be phosphorus limited at the end. And so controlling phosphorus is really, really a key issue here. That big bloom is what sets off the dead zone dynamics. All right, so let me talk to you about now phosphorus. What regulates phosphorus once it gets into the bay? I need to tell you a few things first. POP, that means in my lingo, particulate organic phosphorus. In what you ought to think about here is POP is algae. All right? So, what we're seeing here is the water column of the Chesapeake Bay, the surface waters and the deep waters, and the sediments in brown. So, what happens is dissolved inorganic phosphorus, the same kind of phosphorus that grows corn, algae use. So they start growing because they've got a phosphorus supply. Algae don't just sit on the ground because there is no ground out there. They have a short lifetime. If they're not grazed in the water column, they sink to the bottom to the sediments, and we have sediments in the bottom. Bacteria remineralize that phosphorus back to PO4, but because there's a lot of oxygen in this pot, in this story, oxygen in the water and oxygen in the surface sediments, some good chemistry happens. That is, the oxygen reacts with iron and gives us some iron hydroxides. Those iron hydroxides bind phosphorus. It is like a phosphorus sink. So deep in the sediments, there's plenty of dissolved phosphorus, but it can't get through the surface because of this lid. It's a cap. And that's really important. Some phosphorus does leak out of the sediments and goes up and grows more phytoplankton. If we go to the hypoxic condition, that is the lack of oxygen condition, that's the condition that we see in many places in the bay during the summer. Things change. Okay, so algae are still taking up phosphorus. They deposit to the bottom, and some of that phosphorus is remineralized, but there's no oxygen down there, either in the water or the sediments. So all of that interesting iron phosphorus chemistry goes away. Phosphorus is remineralized. It goes back to the water column. But it gets even trickier. We have sulfate in seawater, and sulfate takes the place of oxygen when there's no oxygen, and one of the end products of that reaction is hydrogen sulfide, which really reacts with iron and effectively boots phosphorus back into solution. So the iron sequestering stops working. And so what we start to see then are huge recycling of phosphorus to grow even more algal blooms. This is so effective in the bay that during the period of time when algal growth is most intense, that is, algae are using nutrients like crazy, that is the time of the year where we see the most phosphorus in the water. Okay, we see almost no nitrogen. So we have got a memory in the sediments of phosphorus that's helping to make eutrophication worse. We see this in field data. Just look at the bottom graph. One's for nitrogen, one's for phosphorus, both the same. And what we see is oxygen decreases to the left. The amount of phosphorus coming out of the water, really, out of the sediments, increases dramatically. Anything above 10 on that bottom graph can grow a lot of algae. Anything above 20, whoa, look out. So we see this in the real world as well as on a chemical reaction spreadsheet. Here's another look at the bay. We start with April here when there's a lot of oxygen in the deep water. Phosphorus concentrations are low. Oxygen starts decreasing in May, and we start to see a hint of higher phosphorus concentrations in June. We're off to the races. July and August, look out. So this is a case of that positive feedback where eutrophication makes eutrophication worse. We did some experiments with phosphorus. We took some cores, some sediment cores from the main stem bay, brought them into the laboratory. We brought them in at a time of the year when the diatom bloom had sunk to the surface. So these cores were as charged up with organic matter as they were going to get that year. And then we fooled the cores and we said, okay, summer's coming, guys. Let's see what you can do. And so we brought on hypoxic and anoxic conditions to the core. 4.5 days later, phosphorus is pouring out of these sediments. You can see that the peak rates were pushing almost 80 units here. And 80 units is just an outrageous phosphorus flux. And for the next month, those rates stayed fairly high. They stayed fairly high even though these cores were getting zero organic matter input. So it means that there's some memory here. We were surprised, in fact, to see any decline in that rate of phosphorus release at all. And it started to open our eyes to an idea that the bay is more responsive than what we thought it would be, which is good. Last bit here. Another thing that can affect phosphorus releases from the sediments is pH. And I know that many of you have pH concerns and treat fields appropriately for pH control. In estuaries, we never measured pH for many years. And the reason was, this is salty water, folks. I mean, it is horrendously buffered. The pH is not going to jack around very much. It's not interesting to measure. Wrong. In places where there are algal blooms, this data from the Potomac, in a 12-hour period, pH goes from just over 7 to pushing 9.5. That is a monstrous pH change. And that monstrous pH change can influence phosphorus flux from sediments. And I've summarized a bunch of measurements. These are real-world measurements, not model output. Real-world measurements. And what they do is they slope dramatically up to the right as pH increases. So this is another, I think, a fairly dramatic example of how some eutrophication, some stress on the system, in this case a pH stress, can take and make everything much more intense. All right? Now, having told you all these bad stories, all right, the restoration trajectories seem to work the same way. That is, when we start to get oxygen in the bottom water, we start to see less recycling. We start to see more denitrification. Okay, it's almost like if we can get 2 or 3 milligrams of oxygen in the bottom water in the summer, we have effectively sewage treatment plants all over the bay bottom, removing nitrogen and sequestering phosphorus. And you know what that costs? Nothing. If we can get it there. So that would have the effect, we believe, of really jump-starting a bay recovery. So let me finish here with a little restoration story. This is from Gunston Cove and the Potomac River. On the part of the slide that doesn't show, nitrogen, or phosphorus first, and then nitrogen reductions were made. The phosphorus reductions were very large. The nitrogen reductions were far less large. But both were really significant. Phosphorus reductions, this is from a sewage treatment plant, were by 90 and 95%. The nitrogen reductions were about by half. And so what we saw was a period of time where not much happened. And what we think is happening there is the system is purging. Okay, nutrients are leaking out of the sediments and going away. The inputs have been reduced. We see a period of time with that red line. That's an indication of algal abundance. It bounces around a little bit, but then at about the year 2000, about 10 years after the sewage treatment plant hit new levels of releases, much reduced, we see a definitive decline in chlorophyll to much, much lower levels. That's one of the things we're looking for. In the black line is an indication of water clarity, and you can see that starting in the late 90s or early, well, about 1999, it started up, and the water became considerably clearer. And then, real importantly, seagrasses by the green bars, which had been, in the part of the graph I'm not showing you, totally not there, started to recolonize, and then, boom, off to the races. So this is one example from a small system where restoration worked generally according to the ideas we have. That is, this is roughly what we would expect to have. I should say also that this is just one example. There are other examples like this around the bay in small systems. There are also examples around the bay for much bigger systems that are starting to show hints or definitive evidence of restoration in the face of some decreasing loads. So let me these are the take-home points. I think the basic model of nutrient enrichment, including phosphorus, is solid. I don't think we need to throw that story out and start again. The dual nutrient reduction strategy, I think, is sound. Both N and P play powerful roles in bay water and habitat quality. Other places around the world have done single nutrient strategies, oftentimes just phosphorus removal. And what they find is on the freshwater end, they get water quality improvement. On the marine end, they get degradation. So I think we're wise to stay with this dual strategy. I think substantial, that's an underlying word. Substantial reductions need to be done still in order to get improved water quality and better habitat. I've showed you a good bit in this talk about the fact that this is tricky business. There are these feedbacks. Our crystal ball is not completely clear on all of these issues. Some things I think will take longer than what we expect. Some things may happen faster. And the reason for that are these complicated feedbacks. And I've just said that we've seen some trends. I remain hopeful. I think if we can all work together and think about reductions in atmospheric deposition, sewage treatment plants, stormwater, and ag, we can get ourselves closer to where we need to be. Thanks for your time.